Hello everybody, my name is Brandon. Welcome back to Cinefessions, where we talk all things media. So it has been, I think, over a year since I've sat down and filmed either a book review or a graphic novel review. I talk about books relatively often with my book hauls, but I haven't spent a lot of time recently talking about my thoughts on the books I've been reading. And frankly, I read a ton of books. I'm up to like almost 90 books this year. And so I read a lot. And so I decided that I need to start talking about them more after I read them. So that's what I decided to do today. I'm going to do kind of a dual review here. We'll start off talking about Black Hole, written by Charles Burns, the graphic novel that I recently finished. And then in the second half of the video, we will talk about my best friend's Exorcism, written by Grady Hendrix. So yeah, excited to finally start talking about books yet again here on the channel. I know this will not be appealing to everyone, so if you're still here, if you've clicked on this video, thank you so much for that support. I really appreciate it. And if you have the time, hit that like button down below because that really does help me out. But with that said, let's not waste any time at all. Let's dive right into my review of both Black Hole and my best friend's Exorcism. So I'll start off with Black Hole by Charles Burns. So this was actually a 12-issue limited edition or limited run series that released from like 1995 through 2005, and then in 2005 they did release this full version of the book. I've owned this for quite a number of years now, and it has been on my to-read list since I bought it. I just never ended up sitting down and reading it. I started it once a long time ago, and I just didn't go back to it for whatever reason, but this time through I finally was able to get through it. Now, this story takes place in the 1970s. We are following a group of teenagers, high school teenagers, I should say, who are basically dealing with this weird sexually transmitted disease that is turning these teenagers into creatures, basically, like it's mutating them. It is a very strange thing, and it eventually, leads some of these kids to become pariahs, given the fact that they look so odd and different. And so some of them end up going to live in the woods and just kind of leading their lives there because either their families don't want them or their friends have, pushed them aside because they look different, whatever the case is. And so this disease, whatever it is that's going around, is, like I mentioned, transmitted through sexual activity, and actually at some point they talk about basically how it transmits through saliva, and so it's very easy to get this. And so that's what we're dealing with, is kind of the story of how some of these teens are dealing with this really weird situation in Seattle in the mid-1970s. Right from the onset, I do want to show you some of the art here. So you can see this is a black and white graphic novel, so something to keep in mind. The art is pretty darn detailed. It almost reminded me, there's a lot of not safe for work art in here, so I'm going to try to avoid that. But this almost reminded me of some of the work from like Uzumaki or the Spiral story, just because of some of the grotesque nature of some of these panels, and so that part was really cool. I didn't have any issues with the art. I thought Charles Burns did a great job with that aspect of this. It is a simple style, but at points it gets really complicated, but it's really cool to kind of decipher what's going on in each panel. So from an art perspective, I thought this was excellently done. I don't think it would have had a better impact if it was in color. I typically tend to enjoy color more than black and white. At least I used to, but now having gotten into manga, I've really started to appreciate black and white art a little bit more. And so I'm glad I read this now as opposed to years ago before I had that appreciation for it. So I think the artwork on this is just really solid. Here's a good example of some of the kind of grotesque nature of that art. And it's just eerie. It's creepy, but done really well. So those are my thoughts on the art. I'm going to put this down just because it's pretty heavy. So didn't have issues there. Where my issues with this story come in is with the actual narrative itself, the story itself. It is a very slow-paced graphic novel, which I don't typically see when I'm reading, a comic book or a graphic novel. Usually those are a lot quicker than your standard novel, but this time around, it just was lacking forward momentum, I think is the best way to describe it. And that's why it took me a little bit longer to get through this one than I had first anticipated. This was actually on my September to be read list, but I didn't actually finish it until October just because it was taking me a little bit longer. I enjoyed it while I was reading it, but as the story progressed, I was very interested on how they were going to kind of wrap it all up and have a fulfilling conclusion. And I think that's where Burns drops the ball a little bit. I don't need my stories to have a cut and dry conclusion to them. But at the same time, I've been following these characters for, quite a number of weeks in this instance, as I'm reading through this. I would like to have some sort of idea maybe of where things are going or what's going to happen to these characters. And this one, it almost just kind of ends. Yes, we do get some conclusions to some of these characters, but not... I don't even know if she would be considered our main character. The person we're following at the end of the story, we don't really get a conclusion there, and things just kind of end, and it doesn't give you any hints on where things might go. And it's odd because it doesn't feel like we end much further than where we began. It's just... you now know these characters, but we really haven't seen them progress to I guess I'll use the word fulfilling state. We get a lot of characters in this one, and that was one of my other problems with it, is that I'm not really sure who the main character was supposed to be. We have our... I don't even know how to explain it without giving spoilers, but we follow a male character at the beginning. He has some kind of love interest with some of these, a couple of the characters, frankly. And then he falls with a different girl as the story goes on, and it's just it plays out oddly. I mean, it makes sense. They're teenagers, they're just doing their thing. They're having fun, especially, on all the drugs they're on. Things are just happening. But at the same time, it's like, why introduce the idea of this if you're not going to play it out at all? If you're not going to give any conclusion to that relationship, it gets very dark as the story progresses, which I honestly didn't expect as it started. It was pretty gross, but it wasn't as dark as it got at the end, which I liked that aspect of it. I thought that was really interesting. So Charles Burns brings up this idea of the mental anguish that these characters are going through, thanks to the fact that they are now a pariah in society, but he doesn't really play it out to any satisfying or any significant end, I guess, because you see what happens in, there is a conclusion just given what happens, but it feels like it's brought up but not explored in the way that I would have liked to see it explored. It's just surface level, and with what they're trying to do here, it felt like he was trying to be a little bit deeper with it. That's especially with the entire graphic novel. It is supposed to be more than just an action book or a horror book. There is more to it than that, but it fails to deliver on kind of those deeper aspects of what these characters are going through, and I found that a little bit disappointing. So while there are some really cool characters in this that I enjoyed following, you do get some beginning, middle, and end to some of their character arcs. We don't see a lot of growth necessarily amongst the individual character in terms of like a personality change or things like that. You do get physical growth given this plague that is going on amongst these teenagers, but that's really about it. And so I enjoyed it while I was reading it, but I didn't love it the entire time, and I think the ending was just not what I was wanting, not where I was hoping things would go. I was hoping there would be something a little bit more than there was at the end. So at the end of the day, I have to give Black Hole by Charles Burns 2.5 out of 5 stars. Let's move over now and talk about My Best Friend's Exorcism, written by Grady Hendrix, and this one was released in 2016. So I do not own a physical version of this. I do own this on Audible, which is how I did it. So I did the audiobook on this, and I'll start out by saying I thought the audiobook narrator was really good. There were moments which were a little awkward where she is screaming and it just felt like a stage scream or a staged scream. And so I just wanted her to kind of go for it a little bit more than she did at points. But overall, I think the narration was really solid, and it helped deliver on a very entertaining book. And so I really enjoyed the narration here. But this book is about a group of teenagers in the 1980s now. So we went from the 1970s over to the 1980s. And this one really felt like it was the 1980s just because of all the pop culture references that Grady Hendrix throws in here. But they work. So don't think I'm pointing that out as something bad about the book, because for me they really worked. But mind you, I am a person who loved Ready Player One, so keep that in mind. Clearly, I don't have an issue with pop culture references. But anyway, so we are following this group of teenagers. They are at a weekend away or at a beach house, whatever the case is. They're on a boat, and they decide that they're going to do some acid. So they do the acid, and one of the girls disappears, who is Gretchen. Our main character here is Abigail, and Gretchen is her best friend. They have been ever since 4th grade, when she was the only one to show up at her roller party, or her roller rink party, and so they've been best friends ever since then. So Gretchen disappears overnight. They are getting ready to call the police when all of a sudden the next day Gretchen shows back up. But something is different about her. She has clearly changed in some way that they don't quite know the extent of. But Abby, her best friend, can really tell that something is different. And given the title of the book, you probably have a good idea of where this is going to go. And this is exactly what you expect it to be. This is about her best friend's exorcism. And so my familiarity with Grady Hendrix starts and stops with his book, Paperbacks from Hell, which was a nonfiction book. If you don't know, that is about basically horror fiction from like the 60s and 70s on, that vintage paperback horror. And it was a really good book. As I said before, I don't think I loved it quite as much as some other people did, but I really liked it. It's a very good book that was super easy to get through. I read it relatively quickly. It was just enjoyable and informative. So if you're interested in that one, definitely check it out. But this time around, obviously, we're working with fiction, so it's a whole different ballgame. But I think that easy to read style is still there. And so this was one I was able to get through relatively quickly. Again, I was doing the audiobook, so it was a little bit different maybe than reading it, but I still found his writing style quite breezy to get through, easy to understand what was going on and grasp. And so I always enjoy that. He's not a writer who wants to talk down to his audience at all, and that is always important to me. It just felt very accessible, which is probably what you would expect given, the title of the book and what this one is about. But I still think that's a positive aspect of Grady Hendrix's writing, is that it is easy to consume, which I think is important. Hendrix does a really wonderful job of setting up this world and making it engaging, and it feels unique, even with all of these pop culture references, which, I got probably 90% of them, but I'm sure there were some things in there that just went over my head. But the world that he builds and he is great, and he takes the time to do that. So this one might move a little bit slower than some people will like, but for me, like, what I love about reading and books is just getting to know these characters, especially if they're interesting characters, and they are here. There is a lot of time spent in their younger days, in their youth of these characters. So from like 4th grade on, we spend a lot of time just getting to understand how these two people became best friends and what their relationship was leading up into this moment, which is what makes this disappearance of Gretchen even more impactful. And so I think, that time spent building these characters up is incredibly important and done really well. Not only do we spend time getting to know these characters, but like one specific example I can think of is just getting to know the school where these girls go, because it's again important to the story. It's not just a public school, it is a private school with very wealthy people, and that is a important aspect to these characters' backgrounds. And so he spends a good amount of time building this up. And again, it might be a little slow for some people, but for me, I loved it. It was always engaging and always just fascinating to learn more about this world and these characters. Hendrix also takes a lot of time building to the climax. So the middle of the book is a bit meatier than you might find in a typical horror book, but I really loved seeing how Abby was interacting with this group of friends, because once the disappearance, I'll call it, happens, there is some tension amongst the group, and they start splitting apart and splintering. And that's where it gets really interesting, because how each of them interact with Gretchen and how Gretchen interacts with them, the change that Gretchen goes through. Abigail is kind of the only one that's really like willing to face it head on. And so I think her interaction with Gretchen and the rest of the group is just really well done. And Hendrix takes his time building that up and laying out how, before we get to that climax. Now, at the end of this is kind of strange, I'll admit, the way that things come together, because obviously we're dealing with an exorcism. And so the way that Abigail, this, young, whatever she is, 16, I guess, 16-year-old girl, brings in an exorcist and just how easy things are to get to the final climax, I thought was a little strange, but I was so engrossed in the story by that point, I didn't really think about it too hard. And it was easy to let it go and just move on. And then the climax occurs. Obviously, I'm not giving any spoilers at all in these reviews, but the very ending, so I guess it would be the resolution, is also just different than the rest of the book. And it's something that might turn off some readers because of the way it does it. It reminds me of like the film Zodiac with, the Fincher film, where I remember sitting in theaters and at the end of it, it jumps like whatever it was, 15 years or 20 years ahead, whatever it was. And there were people in my audience who were like moaning and groaning about the time jump. And I was sitting there like, shut up. Like, this is amazing. How are you moaning at this? Like, this film is fantastic. It's one of my all-time favorites. So of course I was into it. But people just don't like when books do that. And there is a bit of something like that going on here at the end. But for my money, I liked it because it shows their entire relationship literally from day one when they meet in 4th grade at her birthday party all the way through to the end. And I thought that was really cool. I love their relationship. It is just so heartfelt, genuine, and it's so strong, and it gets stronger as the events in the story take place. And so I like seeing how it kind of resolved at the end. And even if you don't love the very end, like the resolution, if you don't love the post-climax, I still think reading the book is worth it, because everything to the climax, I think, is just done so well. And I think a lot of people will probably enjoy that if you are the type of person who doesn't mind a slower burn than your typical horror story. So this was one that I thoroughly enjoyed. I think Grady Hendrix is a really strong writer, and I am very interested to check out his 2 other books that I haven't read yet. There is Horror Store, which is basically like about a haunted IKEA. And I've owned that one for the longest time. And I think that's one I want to do in physical form, because the book itself almost looks like an IKEA magazine at points. I think there's a lot of pictures and stuff in it. So I'll probably do that one physically. But then the other one, I'm going to forget the name, but it's like the Southern Georgia Reading Club or something like that. I'll put a poster up of it, or the cover up. But that one is supposed to be really good too. That is a vampire story. So very intrigued to see what he does here. So I'm glad that my Exorcist Audible or Hoopla rental wouldn't go through, because I was trying to read The Exorcist, but I couldn't get my library card to work because it turns out it was expired. And so I just ended up hitting play on this one instead because it had Exorcist in the title. I figured it would be a good alternative. And so I'm really glad I did, because this was a really enjoyable story that I think a lot of people will probably like. If you are into pop culture references, if you're into the 80s and you don't mind a slow burn with a lot of character growth, then this is probably one you'll enjoy. So I ended up giving My Best Friend's Exorcism, written by Grady Hendrix, 4 out of 5 stars. All right, so those were my thoughts on Black Hole and My Best Friend's Exorcism. I hope you guys liked this style. I do hope to make this a continued thing I do here on the channel, where I talk about some of my recent reads. I don't know that I necessarily need to do individual videos for each of the books I read, but I don't mind doing like these smaller capsule type reviews of everything that I'm reading, kind of like I used to do at back in 2020. So let me know down in the comments below, have you guys read either of these? Was I completely off the mark on one or both of them? Let me know what your thoughts were down in the comments below. I always appreciate your opinions down there, so please leave those. And also give me any other suggestions that might fit the same mold as these two. If there's one you think I might like better than Black Hole, let me know that. Or if there's something similar to My Best Friend's Exorcism, let me know that as well. As always, guys, if you did enjoy this video, though, please give it a like down below. That really helps me out. And like I always say, I don't just talk books, I talk all things media, be it books, movies, video games, collectibles. If it's media related, I'm interested in it. And if you are too, you might consider subscribing. All right, guys, so that's going to do it for today. I just want to say thank you all so much for watching, and I want to encourage you to consume some media today. I'll catch you next time.